moving on to the other very big story of the day, the Supreme Court seemed to have stepped in to try and resolve the farm law crisis that has been brewing over the last several weeks. In fact, farmer groups have been protesting at the border of Delhi since late November last year, demanding a repeal of the 3 controversial farm laws that were passed by Parliament last year. They want a complete repeal. The government has said they will not, and now the ball is in the Supreme Court. The 8th meeting, which took place last week, had also resulted in no resolution. The Supreme Court has now indicated that it may want to stay the implementation of the farm laws and get an expert committee headed by a former Supreme Court Chief Justice of India to take a look at what both sides have to say and come up with a resolution. Abhimanyu Sharma, my colleague, gets you the report of what happened in court today.
The Supreme Court will decide tomorrow if it's going to pass orders on staying the operation of the 3 new farm laws against which protests have been taking place on the borders of Delhi and in various parts of the country. While the top court expressed disappointment with the union government's handling of the situation of farm protests, the court feared that the issue may snowball into something large if it's not taken care of as of now. While the centre opposed any order from the top court on the ground that there was nothing which was violative of fundamental rights or which was legally or legislatively incompetent with the laws, the court told the government that as of now, the issue before the court was not a question of law, but it was related to the fundamental rights and the right to life of people across the country, including the rights of protesting farmers, many of whom have lost their lives in the past few months of protests. While the CJI asked the government to ensure that a constructive solution is reached to as part of consultations with farmer groups have remained insistent that they are not going to hold back their protests till the government repeals the 3 new farm laws, which the government has claimed is for the benefit of farmers. However, farmer groups have opposed these laws, claiming that they will sound a death knell for farmers across the country.
Sanjay Hegde, Senior Advocate, Supreme Court, and Siraj Hussain, former Agricultural Secretary, joining me on the show this evening. Welcome to both of you. Mr. Hegde, let me come to you first. Now, the Supreme Court pulling up the government, a lot of strong words there, but at the end of the day, we'll have to wait and see what it says in its order tomorrow. Do you think the Supreme Court will actually step in and stop the implementation of the law? Many have today raised the question, including the government side lawyers, whether that is tenable, whether the Supreme Court can step in and sort of stay a law that has been passed by Parliament. What are your views on this?
Well, if you're asking me on the question of power, there is no doubt that the Supreme Court has the power to stay legislation. But the Supreme Court has given its own guidelines as to when legislation should be stayed. And those are very strict guidelines. That was also in a case where a High Court had stepped in and stayed some legislation. But on the other hand, there are precedents of this kind. For instance, you will remember that when the Mandal Commission implementation led to North India going up in flames, people burning themselves and all that, the matter ended up in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court stayed the implementation of the Mandal Commission. Thereafter, it examined the entire issue, and a couple of years later, when the 9-judge judgment came, it upheld Mandal with certain riders. But those 2 years gave the country a breather, time to process things, and to accept the new reality. I will not venture to say definitively whether the Supreme Court will go one way or the other, but there are precedents both ways.
You know, the purpose behind doing this seems to also give farmer groups an opportunity to step back withdraw protests from certain areas and come to the negotiating table. Siraj Hussain, you've been of course at the forefront of explaining why these farm laws matter and where it's gone wrong with the actual implementation part of it. Do you think that kind of a breather is just what is needed to find a resolution, and will farmers be amenable to come to the table if a Supreme Court expert committee is at the helm of it?
I think the order of the Supreme Court will diffuse the situation for the time being, and I think that is what the government is looking for. Even though the publications sympathetic to the government have been writing that Supreme Court should not be interfering in policy matters, but I think that is the sense I get, is that the government will welcome such a decision by the Supreme Court, because it will diffuse the situation, give the government and the farmers' unions time to talk to each other in a peaceful manner without much of crowd on the outskirts of Delhi. So I think it may be a good breakthrough.
Mr. Hussain, can you explain to us why there has been no breakthrough so far? There have been 8 rounds of talks, and the government has sent several proposals to the farmer, has said everything short of we will actually repeal the law. Where do you think the sticking points are, and is there a path for reconciliation right now after so many rounds of talks have failed?
See, what has happened is that the government has conceded a lot of ground, but the government is very reluctant and highly wary of repealing the laws, because there may be a thinking in the government that then this will become a norm and there will be many more similar demands from various groups which are affected by enactment of similar laws. So that is the reason why, in my view, the government has been very reluctant, even though the government has announced major concessions. For example, the government has said that now if the state governments want, they can bring the same regulations to trade area as they have for the APMC markets. Similarly, the central government has also said that the MSP regime will continue. So the center has announced a lot of concessions. Short of repealing the laws, I think it has traveled a long distance on the road.
Sanjay Hegde, what do you think is fueling the continuity of the farmer protest despite these concessions? Is it because there is no clarity whether these will be included in the law? Will the law be amended to include all of these points that have been agreed upon? How do you read the situation now that there have been 8 rounds of talks with no real solution in sight?
Well, talks for the sake of talks seem to have happened to a great extent, that the negotiators on the government side also had a particular Lakshman Rekha beyond which they could not cross. There was no question of them agreeing to the laws being withdrawn. On the other side, the farmers, and there are various groups among the farmers. So they had also been sent with a maximalist line that nothing short of withdrawal. In these group situations of unrest, there are as many leaders as there are protesters and as many views. So therefore, it is easy for everybody to agree on a very simplistic bottom line, saying, okay, just get rid of the laws. So therefore, while I do not say that the talks were done in a dishonest manner, there nevertheless was not much of a meeting ground where ultimately a resolution could be worked out. No, neither side had the authority to do that. So given that situation, the Supreme Court stepping in and saying, okay, guys, cool off. Let's keep this not implemented, or let us stay it. And then let's have a process where everything is discussed. In the meanwhile, let all protesters go home. That may be one way of wrapping this up.
What if farmer groups do not agree to this new form of arbitration? Is that a possibility? Where do we go now from then? Because for this to work, farmer groups have to agree to drop their protests and then submit to the Supreme Court's committee if that is what the Supreme Court decides to do. Remember, the final order will be out only tomorrow. The bench assembles tomorrow again.
See, one can't speculate that the farmers will defy the Supreme Court. Nor can one speculate that the Supreme Court will give an order which is entirely unpalatable to farmers. At the end of the day, we are a republic run on the rule of the law, and the ultimate arbiter and interpreter of the law is the Supreme Court. So if the Supreme Court decides something, everybody must abide by it. And of course, they have the right to go back to the Supreme Court and say, no, sir, this is where our problem is. Can you sort this out also? We are running into time constraints also. The unstated thing on the government side is that they have to sort it out before Republic Day. The farmers also are not necessarily very anxious to continue. After all, 60 of them have died. They have nobody likes sitting out in the bitter cold. Nobody likes getting wet in the rains. They have come so far. They feel they have sacrificed a lot, and they think that they should have some semblance of a win.
You know, looking back at the whole process of the farm laws over the last few months, and Siraj Hussain, I'm keen to know your view on this, because these have been touted as huge reforms for the agricultural sector. On paper, on reading them, they indeed do seem to unshackle the farmers from certain rules which have held them back. They can sell freely to anyone, anywhere, but it all seemed to go very, very wrong. What do you think is the reason for this? The Supreme Court today, in one of its observations, talked about, questioning whether there have really been enough consultations before the laws were brought to pass. But the fact that they were brought to pass by parliamentary procedure, do you think that something went wrong along the way?
See, the difficulty in case of agriculture is that at its core, agriculture is a state subject, and that is how the constitution makers, the framers of our constitution, saw agriculture, and rightly so. So there are huge differences across the states and even within the states. So we see that the state governments, which have put enormous effort over the last 4 or 5 decades to put a very robust mandi infrastructure in place, they think that they will be very adversely affected if the trade area has 0 tax while the APMC area has 6% tax. So obviously this differential taxation structure will result in withdrawal of trade from the APMC to outside the APMCs. So the farmers see that as a step in the direction of making MSP procurement itself redundant. Now, one can say that the government has announced very clearly that MSP regime will continue, but the farmers are also being guided by the reports of various committees. CACP itself has been recommending, the Shanta Kumar committee has recommended, and several other committees of the government have been recommending reforms in PDS and so on. So the reason why these reforms have resulted in a kind of a stalemate is because the states were not adequately consulted. And if it had gone to a parliamentary standing committee, then perhaps various other political parties would have also come on board. So the bottom line is that agriculture is primarily a state subject and the states need to come on board.
It really gives one food for thought, because you could have a good set of laws which could help farmers. Were they not communicated properly? What happened since then, and can you really ram down reform? A lot of questions come out of this episode, but meanwhile we will leave it to the Supreme Court to decide what happens next. The order of the Supreme Court will be actually put out tomorrow after the bench assembles again and the hearing continues. Thank you so much, Sanjay Hegde and Siraj Hussain, for joining us today on this big story.